Hi everyone, this is a short screencast for Independent Colleges Dublin for F6 taxation covering industrial buildings. And this is part one of a four-part screencast series. And in this particular part, we're going to be covering the purchase of a second-hand building. Now, I'd refer you to chapter 18 of your BPP study text covering this area. And indeed, normally this area would come up under the sort of banner of corporation tax. That would be the most common exam scenario. And I've set out these four videos along the lines of really scenarios, four typical scenarios that you would expect to see in the exam. And I think that's probably the difficulty with in industrial buildings, is that it's sort of tricky to see the wood for the trees because of the way that invariably the examiner presents the information. So I think the important thing to do really when you're covering this area within your studies and indeed on the day and in practice and revision kit questions is to establish which scenario is it. Outside of the ones that I've shown here, obviously the basic scenario, refer you to your basic knowledge of industrial buildings, is really just this idea of what qualifies and what doesn't as an industrial building. So we need to get that qualifying cost. So we're assuming with these scenarios that we have some sort of qualifying cost, that the sort of the 10% trick isn't being played when we talk about sort of retail showrooms and canteens, etc., etc. So in this first scenario, we're really talking about a company purchasing a second-hand building from another company. So let's be clear on that. This particular industrial building, let's say it's a factory for argument's sake, has been in use by another company. And we're dealing with this scenario whereby company B purchases this second-hand factory, let's say, from company A. And we're trying to figure out that for company B, i.e. the second company, the purchaser as it were, as opposed to the seller, what is the position in relation to the claim for industrial buildings allowances? Okay, so that's really the setup. Let me take you through the detail here. This video is quite short and sweet, but hopefully it'll cover the main areas for you. So we're talking about this first scenario. So the first thing to get clear, I guess, is the building, let's say the factory, satisfies the definition, and that will probably be implicit within the question for this type of scenario. In other words, it will say a factory is being sold from one company to the other. And it has been in use. Okay, that's a key point actually. It has been in use as an industrial building. Okay, now just very briefly on the issue of definitions, what we should remember from our studies, and this is just a cut and paste from the text, is that the most common industrial building that we're going to come across is a factory. So I'm going to focus on that one for the moment. This is taken directly from the legislation, so all of these are indeed classified as industrial buildings, but certainly for our purposes, I'd suspect that a factory is the most common one. Okay. So that's what we're looking at. Let's see what happens when this industrial building is purchased by a company from a company that has put it into some use. Okay. Now the key point for us is really that an industrial building has some form of tax life. A little bit like plant and equipment. It's in effect has a writing down allowance or wear and tear allowance of 12.5%. So really that's finite, isn't it, over the course of the particular piece of equipment's life, in effect 8 years. So over and above that, now for an industrial building, if we assume a rate of 4%, then in effect what we're saying is that an industrial building in the normal course of events has a tax life of 25 years. As indicated here, if we're depreciating or writing off at 4% over 25 years, we're going to get to 100%. So in effect, after that, no industrial buildings allowances will be available. So, this life is in effect the number of years from acquisition, and that's a key point, from acquisition to reach a tax written down value of nil. So let's just say that an industrial building is constructed. We're writing off over 4%. We have a 25-year life. Now, in this particular case, in this particular scenario, we've actually got two companies. One has, let's say, constructed the building or paid a developer to construct it, has incurred some sort of qualifying cost. So from that point, in other words, for the first company, for company A, we have 25 years left to run. So if we then have a company that purchases the building, for argument's sake, after 5 years, really at that point, in other words, after 5 years has elapsed, then the life is only 20 years. And really the key point within this particular scenario is to accept that and then to write off the qualifying cost over that remaining 20 years. A few more quirks to it, which I'll take you through in a moment, but that's the basic setup. These are the key points that we need to remember. Two companies, set tax life really from the off of 25 years. If company B is purchasing down the line, then the tax life at purchase must be less. Okay. Now, in terms of what we do, so we get to the point where there's a purchase by company B from company A of the particular industrial building. What we have to say is, the building's being sold obviously before the 25-year point. So how do we work out what the annual allowance is for this second company? And what we do is use this formula. So this is key. We've got to rote learn this. It's basically the original qualifying cost. Note what I say there is it is the original qualifying cost. So that's the qualifying cost that was used by company A. In other words, the first company. Yeah, there's no sort of a tax written down value cost, as it were. Okay, and we simply take that cost. We take the number of remaining years at the date of purchase, and we divide one by t'other. Now, what you may think there is, well, that's a bit odd because, the cost or the qualifying cost for company A was their cost. But what we just have to accept is that for this particular scenario is that qualifying cost does not change. It does not change for the second company. And we'll see in the example below that the qualifying cost for company A, in effect X Limited, and indeed for company B, A Limited, is exactly the same. Yeah. So if we look down here, we'll see that formula being used. So what we have here is really two companies, as I've said. We have this company purchasing an industrial building. As you see, we've got A purchasing from X. Okay. Now, the purchase was in 2007 for 2.5 or 2.5 million. Now, it gives us some details, and it has to, in relation to X itself. In other words, the company that is doing the selling. It's saying that it purchased the building or the factory in 1999 for the value of 1.7 and certainly put it into use. I mean, that is key. It was put into use immediately. Okay. If it hadn't been, or if it had put into use at a later date, then in effect the qualifying life would have started when it was put into use. Okay. Now, the qualifying cost for X, in other words, the seller, was 1.6 million. And what they're asking us to do is basically compute the annual allowance for the buyer. So I guess the confusing thing here in the question, this is quite simple, but with a lot more information and a lot more other information in relation to other areas within a standard F6 question. I guess the confusion could be, well, what cost is relevant? In other words, what's the cost that I put on the top of that fraction that I've just mentioned? And we're always looking for the qualifying cost. Okay. Now, do note here, as I mentioned above, that this qualifying cost is the qualifying cost to the first company. Yeah, that doesn't change. And I guess this is the thing that students might find difficult to understand. The qualifying cost is the qualifying cost, and that was really set back in 1999. Okay, so we really got to go back to that cost. We're not interested in what they bought it for. We're not interested in what A paid X for the property of 2.5 million. We're interested in the qualifying cost for the original company. So that is a key point that you've got to get your head around. Okay. Now, over and above that, if we just look back up at the formula, it says, the annual allowance is basically the original qualifying cost over the number of years remaining. So really, I guess in this question, what we need to do is say, right, okay, if X Limited put the factory into use, when did it do that? And indeed, how many years have elapsed from that point to the point at which A purchased the factory and indeed put it into use? Okay, so the answer, as you'll see here, and this is just a cut and paste job just from your text, is the answer here is in effect saying that the factory was 8 years old. Yeah, so 8 less 25 equals 17 years. So in effect, when A purchased the factory, there were 17 years remaining in its tax life. Remember, as we said above, that a factory, an industrial building, has a set tax life. So at 4%, that is going to be 25 years. So if 8 years have elapsed, there must be 17 years remaining. So what's A entitled to? Well, and this is, I guess, a little bit odd, but it's something that we just have to accept. We're really saying that in terms of using the fraction above, let's go back to the original qualifying cost for X. Let's put the number of remaining years below in that fraction, and that's where we get the annual allowance, the industrial building allowance available to A, indeed for the next 17 years. Okay, so in effect, this is fixed in the year of purchase. It's certainly not going to change, obviously, unless the amount paid by A is less than 1.6 million, but I don't think that trick is going to be played within an F6 exam. Okay. Also note, just as a matter of interest, if it were purchased after its 25 years have expired, then no IBAs are available. Again, I don't know if I would expect that in an F6 exam. Okay, so I guess the key points for us, and maybe slightly quirky odd points, are that this whole issue of this A company purchasing a second-hand industrial building from another company, that's basically the scenario we're looking at. We really have to say to ourselves, okay, for the first company, what was their qualifying cost? Hopefully they won't mess around with that and give us, a series of different items, that list that we have to look down and say, well, what's qualifying, what isn't, exclude the land, exclude the site costs, etc., the old 10% trick. Hopefully won't do that. But certainly within this scenario, what they will do is make us think about this area. So we need to get that qualifying cost, okay? Once we have that, that should be, fingers crossed, given in the question, okay? So that's the qualifying cost for the original company, in our case, X Limited. And then let's find the remaining years, okay? The remaining years out of the 25, and that's at the date of purchase by the second company. And let's just get a number. Let's get a number as quickly as we can. Let's not get overly worried about, oh God, did I add it up wrong or right? Let's just get a number. Yeah, it shouldn't be too difficult to do, but let's do it quick. Okay. Then what we have to do is just literally one over the other. There's our annual allowance. We're done, and that's what we're going to be sticking in along with our wear and tear allowance. Okay. So that's the basic scenario. Hopefully that's been helpful. As I say, we've got 3 more videos to come on this area, just dealing with each individual scenario that could appear in the exam. Okay, many thanks for listening.